Hello. Alrighty. I am live. Hello. Welcome. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Um, Today I'm going to read a paper I wrote. So over the summer, I attempted a bit of original research um, with a professor, and then I got some feedback from another professor who wasn't involved in the project. But I thought I would read it out loud as a way of better understanding my own paper and seeing, its weaknesses and its strengths and really figuring out what I'm trying to say. Because after getting some feedback, I don't think I didn't think it was that strong when I finished it. But I think my paper got a bit confused, a bit muddled. I think my thesis isn't as rigorous or precise as an academic paper should be. So, like I said, I figure reading it out loud would help me understand what's going on and maybe really work on it. Because I think there's something to what I wrote, but I really need to give it a lot more attention. So yeah, I haven't shared this. This bit of research wasn't published or anything. It's more like a pet project. So yeah, I guess I'll just begin. The full title is Kant, Nietzsche, Arendt on the Philosopher in Politics. And there's two quotations to begin the paper. Thinking does not bring knowledge as do the sciences. Thinking does not produce usable practical wisdom. Thinking does not solve the riddles of the universe. Thinking does not endow us directly with the power to act. Heidegger. I did not start to study philosophy on a whim, and from my youth I devoted considerable effort and care to this study. When I seemed least to be doing so, I was actually most involved in philosophy. And if all philosophical precepts are relevant to life, then, I think, in both my public and private affairs, I have fulfilled the prescriptions of reason and philosophical teaching. Cicero. Introduction. The Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, was a highly educated and broad-minded woman, a correspondent of Voltaire, a disciple of Montesquieu, and a writer and thinker in her own right. In a phrase, an enlightened despot. And this enlightened despot, who believed not only in the aristocracy of birth, but in the aristocracy of the mind as well, was eager to befriend Denis Diderot, one of 18th century France's most brilliant men of letters, remembered today chiefly as the chief editor of the Encyclopédie, as well as his posthumously published dialogues and novels. Diderot's relations with the Empress were casual and familiar, to the envy of many noblemen at her court. Diderot felt so comfortable, in fact, that he even proposed reforms for Catherine's edification. When these reforms were not implemented, he frankly inquired as to why. Monsieur Diderot, she is said to have replied, I have listened with the greatest pleasure to all the inspirations flowing from your brilliant mind. But all your grand philosophies, which I understand very well, would do marvelously in books and do very badly in practice. In your plans for reform, you forget the difference between our two roles. You work only on paper, which consents to anything. It is smooth and flexible, and offers no obstacle either to your imagination or to your pen. Whereas I, poor empress, work on human skin, which is far more prickly and sensitive. It goes without saying that Catherine the Great was by no means anti-intellectual, far from it. Nevertheless, in her view, Diderot's ideas lacked relevance to the material conditions and institutional constraints of imperial Russia. If we interpret the story more symbolically, we can see Diderot and Catherine as embodying an opposing school of thought. We can see Diderot and Catherine as each embodying an opposing school of thought on the role of ideas in politics that are more or less in the same way delineated by Gordon Graham's article, Political Theory and Political Practice, Political Intellectualism and Political Pragmatism. Diderot stands in for the political intellectualists, someone who emphasizes both the importance of a philosophic education for statesmen, as well as the supremacy of ideas in politics. This faction would agree with Bishop George Berkeley when he judged men like Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle as the most consummate in politics, because they were most acute at all abstract and sublime speculation. In a similar vein, Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed that it would not be difficult by an unbroken chain of historical facts to demonstrate the most important changes in the commercial relations of the world had their origin in the closets and lonely walks of uninterested theorists. Catherine stands in for political pragmatism, as someone who views the primary motive in politics as the pursuit of power and the primary actors as ambitious individuals and groups. This faction would agree with Viscount Bolingbroke, who, when describing the Tory ministry which he had been a part of, said that, as all parties have done, the principal spring of our action was to have the government of the state. Our principal views were the preservation of this power, great employments to ourselves, and great opportunities of rewarding those who had helped to raise us. Or as Elie Kadori put it, commenting on nationalist theorists, it is absurd to think that professors of linguistics and collectors of folklore can do the work of statesmen and soldiers. The intellectualist pragmatist split is one way of framing the long-standing distinction between theory and practice, and in politics, at least, this has become something of a cliche or truism. But for some thinkers, there is something else going on. In a 1964 televised interview with the Jewish-German political philosopher Hannah Arendt, the journalist Gunter Gauss began by inquiring into her experience as a woman in the masculine profession of philosophy. "I am afraid I have to protest," she replied. "I do not belong to the circle of philosophers. My profession, if one can even speak of it at all, is political theory. I neither feel like a philosopher, nor do I believe that I have been accepted in the circle of philosophers, as you so kindly suppose." She further elaborates a few moments later that among philosophers there exists a kind of enmity against all politics, which is not a personal question, but lies in the nature of the subject itself. There is necessary tension between philosophy and politics, in Arendt's language, between man as a thinking being and man as an acting being. Because the philosopher can retain a large degree of objectivity when speaking of nature, because he speaks in the name of all mankind. Or, to put it another way, he can speak as a disembodied intellect who coldly examines knowledge and experience before coming to a conclusion. The philosopher cannot take a detached look at politics, because politics is a different sort of activity altogether. Politics is a very personal activity that literally affects our lives on a daily basis. Where are we left then? Was Diderot correct to think that he was in a position to have something important to contribute to the internal affairs of a foreign country? Or is Arendt and the pragmatists correct that philosophy and politics are diametrically opposed? What, in short, is the role of the philosopher in politics? In an attempt to answer this fundamental question, I will offer a brief overview of how three German philosophers, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, and if her spirit can forgive me for the label, Hannah Arendt, dealt with politics in their writings. Kant will stand in for political Kant will stand in for political intellectualism. Nietzsche will stand in for political pragmatism, and Arendt will stand in a class by herself. 2. Immanuel Kant and principled practice. All maxims which require publicity, if they are not to fail in their purpose, can be reconciled both with right and with politics. Kant, Perpetual Peace, a Philosophic Sketch. Kant's relationship with politics in his own day was subtle. Prussia gave him no opportunity for direct involvement in state affairs. Nevertheless, his academic career flourished under Frederick the Great's reign, where, as Lessing said, freedom of speech and press applied to matters of religion alone. It was under Frederick that Kant's most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, was published. And it was in that book that he argued that metaphysical questions such as God's existence, the immortality of the soul, and free will could not be proven by reason or by sense perception, an extremely controversial thing to say in 18th century Europe. But Frederick died in 1786, and his successor, Frederick William II, was far less lenient. Frederick William II had ordered Kant to stop teaching and publishing on religion. One of the times Kant appealed to the theory-practice distinction starts out almost like a report of the conversation between Catherine and Diderot, but then appears to turn into a form of self-defense. It occurs at the beginning of his essay, Perpetual Peace, a Philosophical Sketch. The practical politician tends to look down with great complacency upon the political theorist as a mere academic. The theorist's abstract ideas, the practitioner believes, cannot endanger the state, since the state must be founded upon principles of experience. It thus seems safe to let him fire off his whole broadside, and the worldly wise statesman need not turn a hair. It thus follows that if the practical politician is to be consistent, he must not claim, in the event of a dispute with the theorist, to sense any danger to the state in the opinion which the theorist has randomly uttered in public. By this saving clause, the author of this essay will consider himself expressly safeguarded in correct and proper style against all malicious interpretation. To rephrase Kant's argument, the statesman has no rational reason to fear the philosopher because they are concerned with non-overlapping magisteria. If I may borrow a term the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould coined in a different context. The statesman must concern himself with how things are at any given moment in time. The philosopher can open his mind up to speculations that can be far removed from the world they live in. While Kant was no utopian, acknowledging, for example, that political actors had to be wise as serpents, it was not his belief that theory and practice in politics are as distinct as is often assumed. In the essay, on the common saying this may be true in theory but does not apply in practice, Immanuel Kant delineates the distinction and the relationship between what is called theory as contrasted with practice. A collection of rules, even of practical rules, is a term termed theory. A collection of rules, even of practical rules, is termed theory if the rules concerned are envisioned as principles of a fairly general nature, and if they are abstracted from numerous conditions which, nonetheless, necessarily influence their practical application. Conversely, not all activities are called practice, but only those realizations of a particular purpose which are considered to comply with certain generally conceived principles of procedure. Kant recognizes, reasonably enough, that this saying might well be correct in regards to a theory which concerns objects represented only through concepts, as with objects of mathematics and of philosophy. Such concepts are empty or abstract ideas which either cannot be used at all in practice or only with some practical disadvantage. Yet it is to the shame of philosophy, he says, that we constantly hear people criticize in an arrogant, disdainful tone that whatever may be correct in theory is in fact invalid in practice. As far as he's concerned, this prevalent critique comes of presuming to use experience to reform reason itself in the very attributes which do it most credit. Such illusory wisdom imagines it can see further and more clearly with its mole-like gaze fixed on experience than with the eyes which were bestowed on a being designed to stand upright and to scan the heavens. Beyond that, in a theory founded on the concept of duty, such as politics and ethics, any worries about the empty ideality of the concept completely disappear. For it would not be a duty to strive after a certain effect on our will if this effect were impossible in experience. Since Kant is advocating a direct relationship with theory and practice, to understand Kant the political philosopher, we must understand Kant the anthropologist and historian. In this regard, we need to look no further than another important essay of his, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose. In it, he attempts to discover a purpose in nature behind the senseless course of human events, since we cannot assume that mankind follows any rational purpose on its own. He starts his philosophical anthropology with a proposition that, at least in certain respects, is not too dissimilar from what Darwin would say a century later. All the natural capacities of a creature are destined sooner or later to be developed completely and in conformity with their ends. Kant believes we must assume this, for if this were not the case, we are faced not with a law-governed nature, but with an aimless, random process, and the dismal reign of chance replaces the guiding principles of reason. He finds man's historical purpose in being the only rational animal on Earth. But since a single lifetime is incredibly short in the grand scheme of things, it will take a long, perhaps incalculable series of generations, each passing on its enlightenment to the next, before the species' innate reasoning abilities can be realized to its fullest extent. Reason is also the basis of free will, and as such we can intuit that man was not meant to be guided by instinct, but meant to produce everything out of himself. Given all this, and perceiving the most difficult problem for the species to be that of attaining a civil society which can administer justice universally, he concludes that the hidden purpose of history is to bring about a perfect constitution, the only possible state within which all natural capacities of mankind can be developed completely. Near the end of this essay, Kant considers an important objection to his argument. It is admittedly a strange, and at first sight absurd proposition, to write a history according to an idea of how world events must develop if they are to conform to certain rational ends. It would seem that only a novel could result from such premises. His defense is that our ignorance of the laws that govern human affairs, despite our ignorance of the laws that govern human affairs, his theoretical history may yet serve as a guide to us, representing an otherwise plainless aggregate of human actions as conforming, at least when considered as a whole, to a system. We must make certain assumptions about human beings and about the nature from which they sprung if we wish to orient our thinking and understand real-world affairs. His theoretical starting point is the ability of mankind at self-improvement through his use of reason. The ability of reason to gradually emancipate, or to use Kant's language, enlighten mankind, is the basis of an article he wrote in response to the question, "What is enlightenment?" defining enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, and immaturity as the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. What he sees when he looks about in the world is more immaturity than enlightenment. He sees people relying on external guidance like books, doctors, and priests, rather than having the courage to use their own understanding. He also observes that there are plenty of people who have kindly taken upon themselves to supervise others. Such people and groups will see to it that by far the largest part of mankind, including the entire fair sex, should consider the step forward to maturity not only as difficult, but also as dangerous. What Kant is putting forward here is not some sort of individualist anarchism. A citizen does not have the right to refuse to pay the taxes imposed upon him. Likewise, a clergyman does not have the right to preach anything outside the doctrines of the church. The right each person has, and which cannot be violated in Kant's view, is the public use of his reason. They should be allowed to use reason as a man of learning addressing the entire reading public. If the citizen, as a learned individual, publicly voices his thoughts on the impropriety or even injustice of the taxes imposed upon him, he does not contravene his civil obligations. The same is true of the clergyman who imparts to the public all his carefully considered, well-intentioned thoughts on the mistaken aspects of the church's teachings. A big concern for Kant is an enlightened attitude in religious affairs because our rulers have no interest in assuming the role of guardians over their subjects so far as the arts and sciences are concerned, and secondly, because religious immaturity is the most pernicious and dishonorable variety of all. If priests and legislators prevent a learned individual from speaking his mind publicly, they are renouncing enlightenment completely, including for later generations. This is unconscionable because it means violating and trampling underfoot the sacred rights of man. Or to put it another way, should the guardians regard most of mankind as domesticated animals, they're acting against our historical purpose. They're acting against our betterment. Kant's belief in human betterment gives us key insights into his views on perhaps the most important world event in his lifetime, the French Revolution. He explores the topic in the contest of faculties, concerning himself with the attitude of the onlookers as it reveals itself in public while the drama of great political change is taking place. He notices that onlookers openly express universal yet disinterested sympathy for one set of protagonists against their adversaries, even at the risk of their partiality. Even at the risk their partiality could be of great disadvantage to themselves. Their reaction, because of its universality, proves that mankind as a whole shares a certain character in common, and it also proves that mankind as a whole, and it also proves, because of its disinterestedness, that man has a moral character, or at least the makings of one. But the revolution for Kant did not merely allow us to hope for human improvement. It is already a form of improvement itself, insofar as its influence is strong enough for the present. Kant understands that the revolution may succeed or it may fail, but because this event has aroused in the hearts and desires of all spectators who are not themselves caught up in a sympathy, sorry. Kant understands that the revolution may succeed or it may fail, but because this event has aroused in the hearts and desires of all spectators who are not themselves caught up in it a sympathy with which borders almost on enthusiasm, the revolution couldn't have been caused by anything other than a moral disposition within the human race. Even if the revolution fails, it is an important attempt at reaching for higher moral principles and must be honored as such. What are these principles? There are two that Kant lays out. Firstly, there is the right of every person to give itself a civil constitution of the kind that it sees fit, without interference from other powers. And secondly, once it accepts that the only intrinsically rightful and morally good constitution when a people can have is by its very nature disposed to avoid wars of aggression, i.e. that the only possible constitution is a republican one, at least in its conception, there is the aim, which is also the duty of submitting to those conditions by which war, the source of all evils and moral corruption, can be prevented. Oh, I'm having trouble reading tonight. I'm so sorry. In regards to Kant's republicanism, unlike his comrades in arms, Montesquieu and Voltaire, he was plainly scornful of the British Constitution. It would be an affront to the majesty of the people of Great Britain to say that they lived under an absolute monarchy. Instead, it is said that their constitution is one which limits the will of the monarch through the two houses of parliament acting as representatives of the people. Yet everyone knows very well that the influence of the monarch upon these representatives is so great and so infallible that the aforesaid houses make no decisions except those which His Majesty wishes and recommends through his minister. But Kant, being a loyal subject to the Prussian crown, wasn't going to advocate for the immediate overthrow of all established monarchies. In the politics section of Theory and Practice, he makes it clear that that revolutions are illegitimate. Taking his starting point in social contract theory, he views the social contract as an idea of reason which nonetheless has undoubted practical reality, for it can oblige every legislator to frame laws in such a way that they could have been produced by the united will of a whole nation, and to regard each subject, insofar as he claims citizenship, as if he had consented within the general will. Kant's citing of the general will shows that Kant was deeply influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau had published in 1762 a political treatise called The Social Contract, and everyone knows the first line. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Read out of context, it sounds like almost a call to arms, but this opening burst confuses Rousseau's thoughts and intentions, for he immediately goes on to say that he does not know why men are in chains. What he wants to do is answer the question, what could render the chains legitimate? His answer is that the social contract, his answer is the social contract. But he interprets the social contract quite differently from many previous thinkers. Hobbes, for example, regarded it as the citizens' pact with the monarch, that they would obey the monarch and the monarch would in turn protect them. Rousseau also didn't believe, as indeed it would be hard for anyone to believe, that the social contract was a historical event where all citizens of a city signed a document pledging their loyalty and obedience. Rousseau thought of it as an implicit understanding that exists continuously, here and now, as the shared commitment without which no system of any kind can be legitimate. Not only can a community not persist without inhabitants agreeing to participate in it and obey its laws, the authorities' coercive powers, their monopoly on violence, aren't morally justified. Here's where Rousseau's arguments become, at least in the 18th century context, but maybe in any context, revolutionary. It rests sovereignty not in the rulers, but in the people. This turns all rulers, be they monarchs, oligarchs, or representatives, into civil servants, tasked with carrying out the will of a sovereign people. We're the children of the Enlightenment, so modern readers would see this as obvious, but in the 18th century, this was an absurdity. What was more sensible in the 18th century was that, as Rousseau's contemporary Baron von Grimm stated, the generality of men aren't made for liberty any more than for truth, although they have those words constantly on their lips. Rousseau's argument goes on, and here's where the general will fits in. Since the interests and desires of individuals are always in conflict, individuals must sublimate their separate egos in a collective ego. Rousseau uses the analogy of fractions, with the individual being the numerator and the collective being the denominator. The general will can also be thought of a public spirit or a commercial spirit that functions as the voice not only of the citizens now living, but those dead or yet to be born. It is like some old family that thinks of itself as one through generations, honors its ancestors, and protects its progeny. With all this in mind, Kant argues that once a commonwealth is formed, the goal of a legislator is not to make the people happy, but to ensure the commonwealth's continued existence. It is also crucial that we do not demand perfection from the legislator. The legislator may indeed err in judging whether or not the measures he adopts are prudent, but not in deciding whether or not the laws harmonize with the principle of right. For so long as it is self-contradictory to say that an entire people could agree to such a law, however painful it might be, then the law is in harmony with right. We can think of all existing legal codes as imperfect variations of an ideal legal system that you and I could rationally agree to. As such, it follows that all resistance against the supreme legislative power, all incitement of the subject to violent expressions of discontent, all defiance which breaks out into rebellion, is the greatest and most punishable in a commonwealth, for it destroys its very foundation. This prohibition is absolute. His reasoning is that if the people are given the right to decide how the Constitution should be administered, then there would have to be another head above the head of state to mediate between the latter and the people, which is self-contradictory. Near the end of the Contest of Faculties, he explains that it is the duty of monarchs to govern in a republican, not a democratic manner, even though they may rule autocratically. In other words, they should treat the people in accordance with principles akin in spirit to the laws of freedom which a people of mature rational powers would prescribe for itself, even if the people is not literally asked for its consent. To put it another way, Kant's political philosophy rests on the theory of right. He thinks of right as the sum total of those conditions with which the will of one person can be reconciled with the will of another person in accordance with the universal law of freedom. It doesn't matter what your or my desires are. It doesn't matter what your or my intentions are. What matters is our relationship in external and practical activities. It's right that man, as being able to make choices, can as little escape the concept of right in their private relations as in their public ones. And they will not openly dare to base their politics on opportunistic machinations alone, and thus to refuse altogether to obey the concepts of public right, which is particularly remarkable in the case of international law. Political actors, whether they believe their words or not, are forced to make their actions at least appear to the public like they are morally correct. Or as Rochefoucauld put it, I can't pronounce his name, Rochefoucauld, hypocrisy is vice's tribute to virtue. In other words, if political actors are to some degree or another necessarily incentivized to behave in ways that everyday citizens cannot, and there is little to quarrel with there, this doesn't allow any and all actions in pursuit of your goals. As far as Kant was concerned, there can be no half measures here. It is no use devising hybrid solutions such as pragmatically conditioned right halfway between right and utility, for all politics must bend the knee before right. If principles without power are impotent, then power without principles is evil. 3. Friedrich Nietzsche, Politics and the Will to Power. What is good? Whatever heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. Nietzsche, the Antichrist. After reading a mind as thorough, meticulous, and systematic as Immanuel Kant, one can be forgiven for feeling disoriented if you then turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the exact opposite of Kant in so many ways. If Kant embodied what the French term esprit de système, then Nietzsche was explicitly anti-system. He was quick to deflate reason's bubble when he thought reason had overstepped its bounds. As such, we cannot expect to find in Nietzsche's work a straightforward political program. The famed Nietzsche scholar Walter Kaufmann went so far as to characterize Nietzsche as fundamentally apolitical. Since his concerns were with the individual who was not satisfied with accepted formulas, ranging all the way from patriotism to Protestantism, and including anything that is in any case, to use his phrase, party. You can certainly come away with that assessment of Nietzsche's writings. Being a classical scholar, a man of letters, and an amateur musician, Nietzsche's primary concerns were cultural. And in The Antichrist, he proclaims that all great periods of culture have been periods of political decline. That which is great from the standpoint of culture was always unpolitical, even anti-political. Then, in Ecce Homo, his last book that was an account of his life and work, he declares himself the last anti-political German, whose mind had no trouble transcending merely local, merely national, and limited horizons. Nietzsche had a very specific meaning of apolitical in mind. Far from renouncing politics entirely, he is asserting himself against mainstream and popular political currents of his time. To understand Nietzsche's politics, we should begin by understanding the account of morality. His account of morality. Citing self-preservation as the origin of morality, he concludes that human history can be interpreted as the battle between two moral frameworks, slave morality and master morality. Slaves call good qualities that serve to alleviate the existence of sufferers, such as pity, patience, humility, and friendliness. By contrast, the slave repudiates the virtues of the powerful, such as pride, suspicion, and selflessness, disregard for their inferiors, and revenge against one's enemies. Nietzsche does make clear that the master need not to be devoid of pity, sympathy, and other virtues that polite society pays lip service to. But the master is choosing to pity his enemies at that moment when he could just as easily choose the opposite. He is the creator of values because he knows his worth and standing, and he does not need others' approval. The slave chooses pity out of necessity. He becomes resentful of his master because he is deprived of a genuine active reaction and enacts a merely imaginative vengeance by praising his own actions or lack thereof and condemning his master's. Broadly speaking, he considers Roman values as a superb example of master morality, and he credits, or blames, the Jews of antiquity for turning this imaginary vengeance into a creative act against their Roman masters. It was the Jews who, with a consistency inspiring fear, dared this reversal of values and hung on to it with the teeth of the most profound hatred, the hatred of the powerless. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche asks his readers whether Rome or Judea won the battle, but he considers the answer self-evident. Just think of who it is people bow down to today in Rome as the personification of all the highest values, and not only in Rome, but over almost half the earth. All the places where people have become merely tame or want to become tame. In front of 3 Jews, as we know, and 1 Jewess. These being Jesus, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Jewish values, therefore, had become Christian values. Nietzsche had no patience for Christian values based on weakness and resentment. He called Christianity a religion for the herd, thought anyone simple-minded enough to believe in it was meant to be subjugated, lumped it in with alcohol as one of the 2 great means of corruption, and railed against placing our hopes in an afterlife, since that diminished the worth of this life. But Nietzsche was noticing a profound shift in European culture with great interest, and this is where what may be his most famous idea comes into play, and that's the death of God. He first mentions the concept multiple times in The Gay Science, but one of the most memorable and evocative descriptions of it comes from a tale about a madman who exclaims to a crowd that we are the murderers of God. What he meant was that the socio-political power of Christianity, which was once called Christendom, had been undermined, and that among the educated class, at least, the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-powerful deity who had sacrificed his son as expiation for the evils of mankind was seen as, at best, a comforting fiction. Given the significance of such an event, Nietzsche attempted to be as nuanced in his analysis of the death of God as he could. Nietzsche put into the madman's mouth various metaphors to describe a world without God, the earth being unchained from the sun, an unending fall, not knowing up from down, a lack of warmth, and many more. But later on, the madman declares that there was never a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will, on account of this deed, belong to a higher history than all history up till now. What he hoped for most was that the death of God would clear the way for other ideals, for more robust ideals. But what he saw growing all around him was Christian values in secular form. Born 55 years after the French Revolution, he ridiculed it as the last great slave insurrection based upon the instincts of popular ressentiment, which privileges the rights of the majority over the minority. He judged the rising socialist movement to be the will to the negation of life, since one must desire more in order to become more, predicted that it would lead to the tyranny of the meanest and most brainless, and he blamed the rise of socialism in on the bourgeoisie for making a lavish display of their wealth in the fight against socialism. Sorry, that was... and he blamed the rise of socialism and the bourgeoisie for making a lavish display of their wealth. But he credits socialists with forcing Europeans to retain their manly and warlike virtues in the fight against socialism. And this fight will delay that other great force Nietzsche despises, democracy. He considers democracy impractical, both on the grounds that such a system will always be destabilized by the dissent of a very small minority, and because it preaches the disbelief in all great human beings and in all elite societies. Everyone is everyone else's equal. At bottom, we are one and all self-seeking cattle and mob. But Nietzsche attacked various right-wing or traditionalist causes of his time just as fiercely. He accuses monarchs of waging various wars only as a means of staying relevant, because they were afraid of that democracy would turn them into nothing more than a gorgeous ornament. When he spoke of limited horizons in Ecce Homo, he was referencing German nationalism. He thought of nationalism as a small-minded perspective perpetuated by business interests and rural families to gain greater power and influence. Called himself a great European continuously as a form of protest, and advocated for the merging of nations. He also observed, with perfect clarity, the connection between nationalism and anti-Semitism. Thought anti-Semitism was nothing but envy for the Jews' energy and higher intelligence, and advocated for miscegenation as a way of producing the strongest possible mixed European race. At this point, it's worth asking, how does Nietzsche think this stronger race and these most robust values will come about? At this point, I might go without saying, but it would certainly not be through Christian virtues. Or to put it another way, while Nietzsche generally agreed with the Judeo-Christian view of man as a selfish, aggressive being, In his view, Christians and Jews lack the courage to endorse man's true nature. He intuits, for example, that society or the state was founded by a race of conquerors and masters, which organized for war with the power to organize, which organized for war and with the power to organize without forethought sets its terrifying paws on a subordinate population which perhaps be vast in number but is still without any form, is still wandering aimlessly. He dismisses the social contract on the grounds that he who can command, who is a natural master, has no need for contract, for he has something far better: power. The higher man would be created by the unconditioned will to power, i.e., a desire to dominate and become master over oneself and one's environment, that allows itself severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, secrecy, stoicism, a tempter's art, and devilry of every kind. And to be civilized, pardon the phrase, but even the constraints of civilization, human affairs are a war of all against all. Will to power is not simply survival of the fittest in the Darwinian sense, because natural selection is based on environmental pressures. And if an organism properly fills a niche there, it is in no need for progression as such. Nietzsche believes that the will to power resolves everywhere around preponderance, around growth and expansion. But Nietzsche's philosophy was influenced by Darwinism, insofar as Nietzsche was attempting to construct a naturalistic understanding of society, politics, culture, and human nature. It logically follows that, therefore, when he calls for a return to nature, he explicitly distinguishes his interpretation of nature from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's. Rousseau was sick with unbridled vanity and wanton self-contempt, who praised man when he was pre-civilized. Nietzsche was looking forward, and a precursor to the man of the future that comes up again and again in his work is Napoleon Bonaparte. Speaking of parable, Napoleon was an example of a return to nature as I understand it. Why? Napoleon, like all great artists of government, embraced his worldliness and frankly pursued power. He used conviction and doctrine as tools and weapons whenever necessary, while allowing himself absolute freedom. Napoleon recognized the necessary relationship between the higher man and the terrible man. The higher man is in that sense beyond good and evil. The higher man also possesses a disinterestedness in their work, since many lives will have to be sacrificed in the process. But Napoleon is by no means the only example of what the higher man could be. Nietzsche applies these traits to Julius Caesar as well, and even Otto von Bismarck. In Bismarck's case, however, Nietzsche's comments are mixed. As a young man, Nietzsche had in fact been a German nationalist, a supporter of German unification, worked as a nurse in the Franco-Prussian War as a way of doing his patriotic duty, and he believed that Bismarck was a powerful ally against the agitated rabble and their foolish ideas. But Nietzsche's patriotism did not last long, and he began to feel like Bismarck was too soft, i.e., he had made too many concessions to the Social Democrats, like implementing government-run health insurance and mandatory schooling. Such policies amounted to practical Christianity, and thereby helped to justify further interconnectedness between church and state. Nevertheless, he recognized that Bismarck had a talent for negative integration, i.e., he knew how to organize various parties and coalitions against one another to get what he wanted at any given moment. Elsewhere, Nietzsche writes about Bismarck's Machiavellianism with a good conscience. Now, Nietzsche was an eager student of Niccolo Machiavelli's teachings, so this could be the basis for why Nietzsche never entirely gave up on the Iron Chancellor. And Nietzsche first studied The Prince at Forta boarding school, and its influence can be seen as far back as in an essay he wrote in 1862 when he was still a teenager, Napoleon III. In it, he defends Napoleon III's coup d'etat that took place on December 2nd, 1851, and which ended with the Second French Republic. In a prelude to his later philosophy, the young Nietzsche opens the essay with, "The genius is governed by other and higher laws than the ordinary person, laws that often contradict the general principles of morality and law." Napoleon III's actions are irreproachable insofar as he possesses genius and has the best interests of the people in mind. Even the latter claim has a Machiavellian edge, for the Italian philosopher would readily concede that acting like a boorish sadist is bad policy. Or as Nietzsche put it, without the will of the people, a regime is insecure and exposed to the vengeance of the awakening spirit of the people. Except in such contexts, Nietzsche would never worry for a moment about the will of the people. In Human All Too Human, he approvingly quotes Machiavelli, who said that what matters in politics is not the form a government takes or how much freedom people have, but how permanent and long-lasting the government is. And provided a Christian prince does not practice politics badly, even he would practice realpolitik. But true to his will to overcome man's irresistible urge to systematize, he clarifies in the Antichrist that while he regards Machiavellianism as the blueprint for what perfection is in politics, he calls it superhuman, divine, transcendental, and it can never be achieved by men. The most men can do is to approximate it. What was the politics of the future that Nietzsche envisioned? Nietzsche only gives vague sketches and examples of what the future would look like, but the picture is not entirely opaque. He praises the law of Manu for creating 4 classes of people: priests, warriors, merchants / agriculturalists, and servants. And happily sanctions the servants' abject poverty. He advocates for a new, vast aristocracy based on the most severe self-discipline, in which the will of philosophical men of power and artist tyrants will be stomped on it for thousands of years. These aristocrats would be the only ones that receive an education, and they would not work to survive because labor for money is a shameful act that hinders independence and the life of the mind. They would have to be supported by oppression of the lower classes and slavery of some form or other, although what he means by slavery is not exactly clear. He was against abolishing the slave trade since it diminished the worth of the higher man by elevating the worth of an abstract man. He calls workers factory slaves and advocates that Chinese workers, whom he calls industrians ants, be imported for menial jobs. There should be as little state as possible, since he regards the state and culture as diametrically opposed, and he said that higher minds ought not to be in the service of these workshops. But he was by no means an anarchist. The Christian and the anarchist, both are decadent, he said. Although he was intensely critical of modernity, and his politics certainly owe a lot to his immense knowledge of Greek and Roman history and culture, we can consider Nietzsche reactionary, not in the sense that he wished to turn the clock back, but in that he was a singular voice against his time and ours. He believed the motto that one must destroy before one can build, and he never hesitated to disturb and scandalize his readers, if he thought he had reason to do so. He was once thought of as a proto-Nazi, and this damage to his reputation has never been entirely remedied. But such readings do injustice to the truth. This misunderstanding comes partly from his illiberal ideas. We must make room that someone can be illiberal without embracing fascism. And partly by his nationalistic, anti-Semitic younger sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who, beginning after his mental breakdown and continuing after his death, used her brother's books, and especially his unpublished writings, as a weapon in her own ideological crusade. She found National Socialism congenial to her views, and she became such an important cultural figure in Germany that when she died in 1935, the Führer himself attended her funeral. Others have said he was a pre-postmodernist. I cannot comment on that in depth, but if it's true in the sense that he believed man's capacity to turn the world into abstractions and mathematical formula through philosophy and the natural sciences was not only false, but that it was standing in the way of mankind's potential. This is reflected in his politics as much as anything else. A Nietzschean political theory would be a contradiction in terms. He did not agree with Aristotle that man was primarily a rational animal, and what he admired about Darwin was that evolution by natural selection put man firmly within the bounds of the animal kingdom, rather than separate from or above it. With that fundamental insight, Nietzsche reasoned that we should not view ourselves as angels that can rise above our baser instincts. Our baser instincts are what drive us. Our baser instincts are what drive us that cannot be expected to conform to the beliefs priests and parents inculcate in us at a young age, and a politics that fails to recognize that truth can be dismissed as wishful thinking and sour grapes. But Nietzsche did not believe that shaking people awake from such beautiful dreams was going to be easy or welcome. I know my fate, he said. One day there will be associated with my name the recollection of something frightful, of a crisis like no other before on earth, of the proudest collision of conscience, of a decision invoked against everything that until then had been believed, in demand, sanctified. I am not a man. I am dynamite. What more can be added to this reckless and brilliant self-assessment? 4. Hannah Arendt as pragmatic intellectual. In part 1 of Hannah Arendt's last work, The Life of the Mind, titled simply Thinking, she considers in depth the role of the philosopher in the world. But since the philosopher's primary occupation is thinking, she must understand what it means to think in the first place. She starts by asking the persistent question, what makes us think? And concludes that it's unanswerable besides what Kant calls reason's need, the inner impulse of the faculty to actualize itself in speculation. Reason's need is realized only in the act of thinking. There is no need, or there is no end goal to thinking then, because it undoes every morning what it has finished the night before, i.e., the train of thought continues even after a conclusion on this or that subject is reached, and perhaps the thinker will conclude the exact opposite at a later date. Arendt, quoting Heidegger, says this gives thinking an active Arendt, quoting Heidegger, says this thinking gives an out-of-order quality. Thinking removes the thinker from what she terms the world of appearances, and instead the thinker concerns himself with invisible things such as past events and tangible concepts. She is not alone in this belief. Plato chose spoke of philosophy as chosen solitude, and even as a form of exile. A great mind, born in a petty state whose affairs are beneath notice, it is the supremacy of thought for Plato which leads him to long for a hereafter where those things in which thinking is concerned, such as truth, justice, and beauty, will be no less accessible and real than what now can be perceived with bodily senses. The philosopher must distance himself both from the petty affairs of men and of his own body. But the philosopher, like any other human being, arises out of the world of appearances and can share the layman's puzzled amusement or annoyance at thought's inability to be appeased. Consider Hume's declaration that after spending some time in amusement and companionship, the thoughts he had written down appeared so sterile to him that he was unable to think of them any longer. Indeed, some philosophers seem to regard being a philosopher as one slap in the face after another. Or returning to Plato, after telling the story of a Thracian peasant girl who burst out laughing when she saw Thales fall into a well while he was watching the motion of the heavenly bodies above him, he concludes indignantly, anyone who gives his life to philosophy is open to mockery. The whole rabble will join the peasant girl in laughing at him, as in his helplessness he looks like a fool. The central dilemma of the philosopher, therefore, is that he experiences within himself an intramural warfare between man's common sense, the sixth sense that fits our five senses into a common world, and man's faculty of thought and need of reason, which determines him to remove himself for considerable periods of time. Arendt's concerns with the out-of-order quality of thinking can be found in the hilarious allegorical essay, Heidegger the Fox. Sorry. Yeah, no, that's right. Some typos here. Arendt's concern with the out-of-order quality of thinking can be found in the hilarious allegorical essay, Heidegger the Fox. There once was a fox named Heidegger who was so lacking in slyness that he not only kept getting caught in traps, but couldn't even tell the difference between a trap and a non-trap. After getting caught in one too many traps, Heidegger the Fox hit on an idea completely new and unheard of among foxes. He built his own trap as a burrow, but getting annoyed that no one will visit him in his self-made trap, he decides to decorate his trap beautifully and to hang up unequivocal signs everywhere on it that quite clearly say, come here, everyone. This is a trap, the most beautiful trap in the world. At last, visitors come to see Heidegger. At last, visitors came to see him, and Heidegger the Fox proudly proclaims, "So many are visiting me in my trap that I have become the best of all foxes." And Arendt irreverently adds, and there is some truth in that. Nobody knows the nature of traps better than the one who sits in a trap his whole life. This essay is a criticism of Hannah Arendt's teacher, friend, and former lover, Martin Heidegger, who was one of the most important 20th century German philosophers, and also a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The essay reveals the fate that can befall a professional thinker. If you are someone for whom ideas and abstract concepts are intensely alive, you might take your ideas for reality and involve yourself in much folly by failing to grasp the possible results of your actions and the actions of others. Or if you read your own ideas into an existing movement, you have created a snare that you yourself will get caught in. Oh, I hope I'm still intelligible. I forgot how much of a chore reading out loud is. Perhaps as a remedy for the limitations of the thinking activity, one theme throughout Arendt's work is the long-standing distinction between the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, and the vita activita, the active life. She argues in her lecture, Labor, Work, Action, it is impossible to spend one's entire life in contemplation. It is impossible to escape the active life entirely, because to have time to think, these three things have to be taken care of. You need labor to produce whatever is necessary to keep the human organism alive. You need work to create whatever is needed to house the human body, and you need action in order to organize the living together of many human beings. The distinction between labor and work at first might confuse readers, but she defines labor, as the repetitive process of producing vital necessities that must be fed into the life process of the human being, which only ends with death. Work, by contrast, creates the sheer unending variety of things whose sum total constitutes the human artifice, the world we live in. Finally, action means to take initiative, to begin, as the Greek word archein indicates, or to set something into motion, which is the original meaning of the Latin agere. Labor, work, and action are deeply connected with the fact that we live among other people, but this is especially true of action, which includes speech. Arendt quotes Dante for this purpose, who said that for in every action, what is primarily intended by the doer is the disclosure of his own image. Action, which projects information about ourselves to those around us, and needs others to see and hear it, because it is fleeting. But much to our disappointment, action is both permanent and it rarely has the direct effect that we intend it to. Yet the life of man would be doomed beyond salvation without action, because our capacity to start something new allows us to learn, grow, and change up to the moment of death. Arendt returns Arendt returns to active life in her book, The Human Condition. It is here that she wishes to understand the spaces with which people act, and she calls these the social, the private, and the public. She traces the public-private distinction back to antiquity, with the private sphere corresponding to the household, and the public sphere being the political realm. In the private sphere, people were driven by their wants and needs. The driving force was life itself. In the public sphere, or the political sphere, people were concerned with using their freedom, and if they had the wealth and health necessary for freedom in public, they knew only equals, whereas the household was the center of the strictest inequality. To be free meant both not to be subject to the necessity of life or to the command of another, and not to be in command oneself. All in all, a public-private distinction represents things that should be shown and things that should be hidden. But the distinction is blurred in the modern age because we have the social sphere, in which we see the body of peoples and political communities in the image of a family whose everyday affairs have to be taken care of by a gigantic nationwide administration of housekeeping. Yet our understanding of the private sphere is also very different. Not only would we not agree with the Greeks that a life spent in the privacy of one's own idiom, outside the world of the common, is idiotic by definition, or with the Romans, to whom privacy offered but a temporary refuge from the business of the res publica. We call private today a sphere of intimacy whose beginnings we may be able to trace back to late Rome, antiquity, but whose peculiar manifoldness and variety were certainly unknown to any period prior to the modern age. This intimacy, discovered in Arendt's view by Rousseau, was a rebellion against society, which by its very nature expects from each of its members a certain kind of behavior, imposing innumerable and various rules, all of which tend to normalize its members, to make them behave, to exclude spontaneous action, or outstanding achievement. And we can see how Arendt's breakdown of active life influenced her politics directly in her analysis of enforced integration in American public schools. Reflections on Little Rock. Even if read today, her arguments are terribly backwards. The American Republic's right is based on the inequality of all citizens, and while equality before the law has become an inalienable principle of all modern constitutional governments, equality as such is of greater importance in the political life of the Republic than in any other form of government. Again, politics is about equality. Society, by contrast, that curious, somewhat hybrid realm between the political and the private, in which, since the beginning of the modern age, most men have spent the greater part of their lives, is founded upon the need to earn a living, or attracted by the desire to follow our vocation, or enticed by the pleasure of company, and once we have entered it, we become subject to the old adage, like attracts like. It is founded, in other words, on discrimination. Our private lives are based on neither of these things, but by exclusiveness. Here we choose those with whom we wish to spend our lives, personal friends, and those we love. And our choice is guided not by likeness, but strikes inexplicably and unerringly at one person in his uniqueness, his unlikeness to all other people we know. Given all this, she was against laws prohibiting interracial marriage and laws enforcing segregation, i.e., she believed that the state had not only the right but the duty to make sure that the discrimination practices are not legally enforced. But she thought that enforced integration in public schools violated the parents' private right over their children and the social right to free association. Enforced integration also legally compelled a child to face a political conflict between her social and private life, and Arendt did not think children were capable of dealing with such delicate matters. Despite her criticisms of thinking generally and philosophy specifically, she was a woman deeply engaged in thinking and philosophical speculation throughout her life. We cannot, therefore, characterize Arendt as somehow anti-thinking. To understand that, we need to look no further than her controversial book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report of the Israeli trial of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was one of the prominent bureaucrats responsible for the logistics behind deporting and transporting the Jews in the Third Reich. And Arendt, who attended the trial, was most disgusted by one thing: his lack of original and profound thought. As Arendt described him, Eichmann did not suffer from a case of insane hatred of Jews. As for interpersonal behavior, the majority of the testimonies indicate that he had been rather decent towards his subordinates. On top of that, being the Reich's expert on Jewish affairs, he expressed admiration for Zionism because, according to him, he shared with Zionists an idealism. An idealist for Eichmann was someone who was prepared to sacrifice for his idea and everything, and especially everybody. He even insisted multiple times during his trial that his thought always tended towards a political solution to the Jewish question rather than a physical solution, i.e., expulsion rather than extermination. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. These we're almost there, like 10 pages left, roughly. These clarifications, I'm saying that more for myself than anything. These clarifications, if we can call them that, did not help Eichmann's case in the slightest, and the judges thought him a liar. There were psychiatrists in Jerusalem who concluded that Eichmann was a perverted, sadistic personality and someone obsessed with a dangerous and insatiable urge to kill. Arendt thought that these conclusions caused people to miss the greatest moral and even legal challenge of the whole case, i.e., that an average, normal person, neither feeble-minded, nor indoctrinated, nor cynical, could be perfectly incapable of telling right from wrong. This was seen as an extraordinary claim by many readers, but Arendt had her reasons for making it. Who was Eichmann if not a monster? He was, for one thing, a joiner who remembered thinking on May 8th, 1945, the day Germany was defeated, that I would have to live a leaderless and difficult individual life. I would receive no directives from anybody, no orders and commands would any longer be issued to me. No pertinent ordinances would be there to consult. In brief, a life never known lay before me. He was a man who constantly contradicted himself, disclaiming all oaths, and then when asked if he wished to testify in his defense that he could do so with or without oath, claiming to take responsibility for his actions in the courtroom while filing documents requesting mercy, feeling proud that he was part of a historic moment while also claiming to want to make peace with the Jewish people. And his conversation throughout the various interviews and cross-examinations was full of self-fabricated stock phrases and cliches which gave him an extraordinary sense of elation to utter. At one moment that extremely irritated Arendt was Eichmann's misuse of Immanuel Kant. Eichmann claimed to have lived his whole life according to Kant's moral precepts, and especially according to a Kantian definition of duty. And while describing Kant's categorical imperative adequate enough with the expression that one's will must always be such that it can become the principle of general laws, he distorts Kant into the dictum, act as if the principles of your actions were the same as that of the legislator or of the law of the land. While we have seen Kant's total rejection of rebellion, he was also clear that free speech and public debate was necessary for moral and intellectual progress to occur, and the Nazis were always quick to squash the opposition inside and outside the party. Arendt points out the other major flaw in Eichmann's pseudo-Kantianism. Kant regarded every individual as a legislator in that she acts in the world, and she therefore must use her practical reason to figure out the basic principles that law should be based on. This rules out Eichmann's blind obedience, since he let others do his thinking for him and simply carried out orders. His obedience to the cause was absolute, and this fact showed itself with perfect clarity in the fall of 1944, when Heinrich Himmler, part of a growing moderate wing of the party that sensed Germany's imminent defeat and was looking for every possible escape to end the systematic extermination, was looking for every possible escape route from their untenable situation, issued repeated orders behind Hitler's back to end the systemic extermination. Eichmann responded to one such order by threatening to take the matter up with Hitler himself, and continued transporting Jews whenever he could get away with it. If Eichmann's greatest crime wasn't thoughtlessness, then at least from Arendt's perspective, the major cause of his crime his crimes was thoughtlessness. You can go so far as to call Eichmann the anti-Socrates, because Socrates' two major propositions, interconnected of course, are: it is better to be wrong than to do wrong, and it is better for me that my lyre or a chorus I directed should be out of tune and loud with discord, and that multitudes of men should disagree with me rather than I, being one, should be out of harmony with myself and contradict me. The final statement is not obvious unless you, like Socrates, are someone in love with wisdom and in the need of thinking about everything and examining everything. Such a person would rather have a wrong committed against them than wrong someone else, because the thinking activity is, as Plato said, a soundless dialogue between me and myself. The thinker is both the one who asks and the one who answers. What Socrates realized was that when he was alone in thought, he could never get away from his partner, his friend, that part of himself with whom he had the soundless conversations after the day was through, and who investigated his conduct. But if he committed wrongdoings, he could no longer be in harmony with himself. He could no longer coexist with that little voice in his head. As Arendt put it, who would want to be the friend of and have to live together with a murderer, not even another murderer? The only way to escape this little voice in our head that interrogates us, in the same way that Socrates interrogated his fellow citizens, is not to think. And this is exactly what Eichmann did. Without talking to himself, without the back and forth with his inner voice, he was able to hold himself accountable for what he was unable to hold himself accountable for what he did each day. He was in this way split off from his own actions and decisions, and that's why he was able to do atrocious things and avoid, as the saying goes, a crisis of conscience. He befriended and lived with a murderer because he didn't allow himself to think, or wasn't able to think, about the fact that he was a murderer. Eichmann's thoughtlessness blocked him from the most important truths about himself and the world around him. As was mentioned earlier, Eichmann in Jerusalem was a controversial work, and from Arendt's vantage point, her critics were being misleading and dishonest. As such, she wrote Politics and Truth to explore the concept's role in politics, but in the process shows how she synthesizes thinking and action. No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are in rather bad terms with each other, she wrote, and no one, as far as I know, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues. He is not considered with rational truth found in mathematics, science, or philosophy, but factual truths. She separates factual truths because when we consider the factual truth of, say, the role during the Russian Revolution of a man by the name of Leon Trotsky, who appeared in one of the Soviet history books, we at once become aware of how much vulnerable they are than all the kinds of rational truth put together. Facts relating to an event might be hard to determine after the event is over because of the ever-changing affairs of men. Beyond that, factual truth concerns itself and circumstances in which many are involved. It is established by witnesses and depends upon testimony. It exists only to the extent that it is spoken about, and even if it occurs in the domain of privacy. It is political by nature. To use pre-modern language, in human affairs there aren't eternal truths, but momentary opinions. Yet this does not mean reason in politics is useless or impossible. As James Madison argues, the reason of man, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. If the individual wishes to have rational truth, all they need is their own solid reasoning. But if the individual wishes to know the strength of this or that opinion, then she needs the number which he supposes to have entertained the same opinion. She needs other people. But Arendt does not think opinion needs to have a negative connotation, since facts informs opinions, and opinions inspired by different interests and passions can differ widely and still be legitimate as long as they respect factual truth. Arendt is scornful of the idea that historical fact facts don't exist because there are brutally elementary data, like the fact that on August 4th, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium instead of Belgium invading Germany, or instead of France invading Switzerland. Truth in general has a despotic character and preemptorily claims to be acknowledged and precludes debate. Yet, since factual truths are not often obvious, it can be an uphill battle to fight for these truths to be accepted. A liar has an easier time in politics because lying, as an attempt to change the record, is already a form of action in a way that truth-telling is not. The truth-teller is an observer more than anything else, and since the liar is attempted to fashion the facts for his own advantage, he has the advantage in persuasion as well. He will make the facts appear to fit his lies. But lies, which change back the past and present in their former state of potentiality, derives the political realm's instability, derives the political realm's instability and ability, derides, sorry, the political realm's instability and ability to respond to the future. However difficult facts are to prove, they last longer than the power formations created by men. Truth, then, is anti-political because it's based on the solitude of the philosopher, the isolation of the scientist and the artist, the impartiality of the historian and the judge, and the independence of the fact finder, the witness, and the reporter. Political actor cannot be solitary, isolated, impartial, or independent. To understand and efficiently act within the political realm, therefore, we need professionals mentioned above, and institutions such as the academy and the legal system, which stand outside the political realm. In a phrase, truth is the compass and guide we need to chart our course, even if we're dealing with the opinions of human affairs. Iret put it succinctly at the very end of the essay. Conceptually, we may call research what we cannot change, call truth what we cannot change. Metaphorically, it is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above. And neither pure truth nor pure action nor pure thought can give us truth. Five, concluding remarks for future research. An important point not mentioned above about truth in politics is that Arendt discourses on the important role of that storytelling plays in our lives and in our knowledge of the world. Reality, she says, is different from and more than the totality of facts and events which anyhow is ascertainable. Who says what is always tells a story, and in this story, the particular facts lose their contingency and acquire some humanely comprehensible meaning. She claims she classes historians with the poets and the novelists, but that is not meant to degrade the historian because storytellers teach acceptance of things as they are. In a similar vein, this essay is meant to be a story about the philosopher's relationship with politics as seen through three thinkers who sprang from and worked in the German intellectual tradition. We begin with Immanuel Kant, who was deeply rooted in the Age of Enlightenment, somehow managed to be a savage critic, while at the same time being scrupulously rational himself. Nevertheless, however fallible reason is, however unintelligible the world may be, reason is our best guide in ethics and politics, no less than in science and scholarship. He is a political intellectualist because he argues that ethical truths must take precedent over power. Friedrich Nietzsche comes next. He interpreted the Enlightenment's ability to liberate men from archaic way of thinking. He incorporated the Enlightenment's ability to liberate men from archaic ways of thinking, while at the same time rejecting what he saw as modern superstitions about freedom and equality. He is a political pragmatist because, while ideas matter to Nietzsche, action, sometimes even brutal, bloodthirsty action, take precedent. Last but not least, we have Hannah Arendt. She distanced herself from her youthful endeavors, philosophy, and advocated incessantly for the active life, but a peculiar form of the active life heavily influenced by the contemplative life. This is why she cannot be categorized in the two positions. She cannot be categorized as adhering to either position. The story does not end with Arendt, who died in 1975. In the highly interconnected world of the 21st century, in which what happens in one country can affect a country halfway across the globe, and where everyone is bombarded with information on a daily basis from television, radio, and primarily the internet, it's fair to say that many people are growing more cynical and more skeptical. The baser motives of political leaders, both our own and our enemies, appear to us to be on full display. But beyond this, it is seen as an existential necessity for war leaders to be open to behaving in brutal, calculating ways, because the world is a dangerous place full of dangerous villains, or so the argument goes, at least. The influence of ideas and ideology in this picture, and by extension, the stature of the philosopher, is severely restricted, even if people couch their language in ideological terms for rhetorical or ethical reasons. Given this state of affairs, political pragmatism is seen as more sensible, as the more sensible position. This is Gordon Graham's position. He dismisses the argument that theorists work with ends and politicians work with means, because politicians need not follow the ends that philosophers want, or indeed even the ends of their constituents' wants, and the distinctions between ends and means is not clear-cut. A policy might be an end at one moment and the means to another end at a later date. But even if the mean-end distinction stands, it's not clear whether the end properly proposed by a rational political theory, however defined, are better than the self-interested needs of a politician. A rational theory does not itself bring out its end, and does not itself lead to success. Graham sees some reason in the appeal to consensus as a way to bridge theory and practice. He gives the example of John Rawls' thought experiment, where if a group of people were planning a society without knowing who they would be within that society, certain institutions and welfare would be accepted by all, if only on the grounds of self-interest. They all might agree on access to healthcare, say, because none of them want to die from otherwise treatable diseases. But Graham rejects the consensus argument and the rationality argument on the grounds that political affairs are highly contingent. He cites Markov's chain, named for the Russian mathematician Andrei Markov, who demonstrates that given an intended sequence of events, we can predict the likelihood that the last event will happen given the first event by multiplying the probabilities. The greater the sequence of events, which is to say the greater distance between the first event and the last event, the likelihood that the last event will occur decreases. Graham doesn't use Markov's chain as a reason you shouldn't involve yourself in politics, but only to surmise that undertaking political action cannot be rational, statistically speaking, because your actions aren't likely to lead to the outcome you desire. Nonetheless, Graham does attempt to be nuanced. His understanding of pragmatism is not is not so simple-minded as to mean that opinion and principles are totally irrelevant. Opinions and principles do matter, but they matter on pragmatic grounds. Politics is a communal act. And for communal activities to function, the actors need a way to communicate with each other. They need reasons to act, and they need to garner support for their goals. These last two factors lead to the conclusion that, quoting Berlin again, among the problems which form the core of traditional political theory are those, for instance, of the nature of equality, of rights, law, authority, rules. When we were asked what the most fundamental of all political questions, why should anyone obey anyone else, we were asking for the explanation of what is normative in such notions as authority, sovereignty, liberty. But even if political issues are normative, we would be insufficient actors if we reject pragmatism and place it not just for intellectualism, and replace it not just with intellectualism, but for dogmatism. Graham puts it succinctly: it is better to act effectively than to have sound opinions. The last statement is not wrong, but tautological. Within the work of appearances, we have goals we wish to achieve, whether that be more localized goals like starting a family and going to law school, or larger goals like passing legislation and going to war. Even the Buddhist monk who spends years deep in meditation has the goal of conquering the ebb and flow of his mind. So whatever your goals are, if you're truly acting effectively, then by definition, that's more important than having the right opinions. It's also quite telling that he brings up political intellectualism. How political intellectualism? Our first and foremost. Oh, sorry. I got distracted. It's also quite telling that he brings up how political intellectualism can become dogmatism. Dogma is unquestioned belief, and strict adherence to ideas certainly can impede your ability to act effectively. To give a hypothetical example, one could argue the reason Joseph Stalin outmaneuvered Leon Trotsky in the power struggle that ensued after Lenin's death is that Stalin was less of a dogmatist than Trotsky. While both believed in the inevitable spread of socialism, Stalin thought the material conditions made that spread less likely in the short term, and therefore advocated for his model of socialism in one country. But even if dogma doesn't prevent you from proper action, it could lead you to behave in ways that we might regard as abhorrent and reprehensible. The strength of political pragmatism is its naturalism, which is why Nietzsche fits in so well with the school of thought. Since 1859, the year Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, scientists and scholars have searched for a way of studying the human species like we might study bees or ants. What Darwin demonstrated was that humans are animals first and foremost, and animals are focused on surviving the environmental conditions they find themselves in: climate, geography, predation, population density, etc., long enough to pass on their genes through reproduction. A century later, Karl Marx introduced his materialist conception of history, and that can be seen as a logical extension of the Darwinian revolution. Indeed, most of us probably take it for granted that throughout the ages, individuals and collectives have competed for resources, and that this competition led, bit by bit, along with an incalculable number of other factors, to the sequence of events known as history. Yet Friedrich Nietzsche was involved in many battles over normative questions in his lifetime. And Graham asserts that politics is normative and that people need reasons to act and persuade others to fight for similar things. If we wish to retain the insights of naturalism, therefore, then we're forced to agree with Peter J. Richardson and Robert Boyd in Not by Genes Alone, How Culture Transforms Human Evolution, when they say that culture is part of biology. Richardson and Boyd argued that if we want to understand how humans came to be the kind of animal we are, then we must construct a theory in which culture has a proper role and in which it is ultimately intertwined with other aspects of human biology. This is a controversial subject that rests on what is essentially an empirical question, and one that goes beyond the scope of this paper at that. It is certainly a fascinating question, whether worthy of further investigation, because since so much of human life is based on normative questions, it would solve some theoretical issues if we regard man not as the rational animal, nor as the political animal, but the cultural animal, or the ideological animal. Ideological quarrels, after all, are often cultural quarrels, and politics itself is an extension of culture to one degree or another. But even if one is unwilling to espouse that ideas and culture are what make us uniquely human, it is beyond doubt that ideas and cultures have some influence, and whatever they have an influence is a place in which the philosopher can play an influential role. It's possible for someone to be persuaded by Peter Singer's animal liberation and become an animal rights activist. It's possible that someone reads the political writings of Noam Chomsky and subsequently votes for non-interventionist candidates. It's possible that someone reads Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment and concludes that a neo-reactionary worldview is necessary to deal with the ills of modernity. Intellectual influence is very clearly different from the influence exerted by states and corporations and militaries. But to echo Arendt, there are forces separate from everyday party politics that shape our lives. And some people incorporate those other forces into our worldviews, and in turn reshape politics. Statesmen seem to be aware of this, much to the dismay of the philosopher. Socrates is the most famous example of philosophic martyrdom, but that was only the beginning. Indeed, much of the history of philosophy is one of philosophers being censored, exiled, or worse, even killed by political and religious authorities alike. If philosophers have a tendency to awaken people from their dogmatic slumber, or simply pester people with unpopular ideas, it is partly because all men are social creatures, but it comes from a need associated with the thinking activity. Even though the act of thinking itself is individualistic, Arendt notes in her lectures on Kant's political philosophy that unless you can somehow communicate and expose to the test of others, either orally or in writing, whatever you may have found out when you were alone, thinking is exerted in solitude will disappear. In the words of Karl Jaspers, truth is what I can communicate. Or as Kant put it, we can admittedly say that whereas a higher authority may deprive us of our freedom of speech or of writing, it cannot deprive us of the freedom of thought. But how much and how accurately would we think if we did not think, so to speak, in a community with others to whom we communicate our thoughts and to communicate their thoughts to us? Not only then do philosophers have an influence on people's ideas, but philosophy is a pro-social endeavor, and being pro-social is a necessary basis, is the necessary basis of our political life. That is the end of my paper. So, and my voice is tired. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and take care.